Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell me which country you're watching from. I always love knowing how far these stories travel. Now listen closely. Something strange happened, and it all started here. I tell this to you because I promised myself, on the coldest sleepless night after it happened, that I would set the memory down somewhere outside my head and not carry it alone any longer. My name is Malik, and I worked as a preservation surveyor for old rural places, barns, wells, forgotten village centers, a job that sends you to corners the world forgets, and it was that work that took me to Salim's Hollow, a village wrapped in a bowl of dark hills that locals would not speak of on market. Days and children were warned away from, as if the valley itself were contagious. When I first saw it, the road had already given up to ruts and moss, a last ribbon of cart trail that dissolved into a lane of roots and stone, and I arrived late, the sky bruised and low, breath making small ghosts before my mouth in the cold, feeling more like trespass than travel. Salim's Hollow looked abandoned at a glance. Low clustered houses leaning toward one another as if in conspiracy, shutters warped and bolted with iron bars, walls skinned in lichen, the mosque minaret tilting like a tired finger toward the sky. Yet the place had a presence, like a chest that still drew air though the lungs inside were empty. Some doors were ajar just enough to show the blackness within, while others were shut tight. And there were signs of recent life too, cooking pots with crusted porridge, a child's shoe under a bench, hair rubbed from the stairs where someone had run, which made me pause. The village had not simply been abandoned, it had been paused in a hurry, like those tableaus in museums where bodies are frozen mid-step. I had been warned twice on the way in by people at the last hamlet, once by a woman with too many rings who refused to look at my map, and once by a young man whose hands trembled as he passed me a thermos and said, "They call it a hollow because what swallows sound lives down there. If you go, don't answer," and the words lodged in my ear like a pebble. Of course I told myself superstition explained everything. Poor heating, a well that gurgled oddly, wind trapped in stone alleys. But that very night, as I set up a small tent between two collapsed walls, I felt watched by something that measured patience the way farmers measure rain. And when the first voice came, it was not a shout or a moan, but a tiny, coaxing sound from the old well at the hollow center, an image I had studied in my files, where the well's mouth was ringed with dark stones and old carvings half-eaten by moss. Malik, the sound breathed, my name under the ribbed lip of the earth, spoken with a softness like someone turning a page for a child who cannot sleep, and in spite of everything sensible in me I stood, flashlight in one hand, jacket zipped tight against the night, and walked the lane toward the sound, because there is a particular stupidity that lives inside people who call themselves researchers. Curiosity mixed with an idea that if you stare long enough at a secret you will find a solution rather than a trap. The well's mouth gaped black. When I hung the flashlight over it, the beam hit nothing but a void that drank the light as if by design, and from the darkness I heard a chorus, not one voice but many layered, soft and patient. "We are thirsty. We remember your voice." It spoke like someone reciting a ritual. I thought first that the sounds came from below, water hitting stone, a wildlife den, a trapped animal. But then I felt it under my boots, a vibration low and slow, as if something within the hollow pushed outward like breath escaping a long silent body. Behind me, a door creaked as if responding, and I turned to watch the narrow alley where an old man stood in the doorway between two houses, a lantern in his hand that did not glow bright so much as it soaked up light around it. He was the only real person I had seen since I arrived. All other signs of life were shadows, and when he said, almost as if answering without knowing he had spoken, "You shouldn't be here after the bell," his teeth made small sounds against the inside of the words. When I asked him which bell, he only tapped the iron key at his waist and looked at the well as though remembering, then shook his head and put the lantern out with a movement like closing a book, and I watched the light die and the hollow deepen like a wound. That night, sleep came in thin pieces of dream where the same child's voice called, and I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth and a fullness of dread in my chest. At dawn I explored the houses and found walls scratched with names, long lists etched by fingers sharp with desperation, years of names ending abruptly with nothing, and a single sentence repeated in different hands, "Do not feed the quiet," written in older and older script until the letters blurred into moss. And when I asked the old man at the lantern about it, he told me, "The hollow listens, and when it likes a sound it keeps it." He would not say more. That afternoon I met one more inhabitant, a woman who moved like someone with too many secrets tucked in her pockets, who offered me tea in silence and would not meet my eyes, and as I took the scalding cup I noticed faint wet prints on her palms and on the hem of her dress, like traces of something that had crawled across her on a previous night. She confessed, finally, that the well had always been there, older than the first houses, and that generations ago a promise was made. A vow to feed a hunger with the voices of travelers in exchange for the valley's protection during lean winters, a bargain made by mouths trembling from frost and fear, but bargains have teeth. "We gave it a name," she whispered, shaking, "and it learned names. I should have left then, but the study that brought me there demanded I record everything, and besides I thought I was safe, a rational man against superstition." The next dusk, as fog crept like a slow animal through the alleys, the hollow's bell, a little bell hung on a crossbeam near the mosque, barely noticeable, chimed once, though no wind moved, and the sound spread in a pitch that seemed to scrape the inside of my skull. The old man's eyes slid to the well, and his lips formed a word I still cannot erase. "Answer," he mouthed. "When I say things get worse, understand that I cannot choose softer verbs. Worse is a ladder with no bottom, and that bell was the first rung. Once it tolled, the air changed as if someone had pulled a curtain across the valley's face, and behind it the world became of a single texture, low, compressed, listening. Whatever had been patient turned hungry in a currency I could not recognize. Not meat or coin, but sound, speech, memory, names. And as evening spread, people's faces around me slackened like paper left in rain, eyes dulling but their mouths forming small shapes as if mouthing lines from some play they had practiced for years. I went back to the well despite every warning, because stubbornness is a craft I have perfected, and it feels like penitence when one returns to one's mistakes on purpose. The villagers avoided my footprint path, but watched me with an intensity that felt like accusation, and a child with two clear teeth and a shawl around his shoulders approached to stand beside me at the rim as if sent by the well. The boy was no more than 10. His voice had a flatness that made the hairs on my forearm rise. "It is thirsty tonight," he said. "It tastes fear best." I asked him what it wanted, and he said nothing more than a riddle. "A name not spoken here will burn under its tongue." When I lowered the flashlight into the throat of the stone, the beam met nothing but a slow, dense black that swallowed light without reflection, and then the sound began. First a single syllable, like a stone dropping into water, then another, layered, then heel-deep into my bones the hollow's choir multiplied until it formed a tide. It spoke in a cadence like prayer, looping my name, and then it added other names not of the valley at all, places I had not told anyone I had come from, names of my schoolteacher, the bus driver who once gave me a lift down country roads, the name of my brother whom I had not seen in years, and each name hit me like a small hand around my throat. I stumbled backward, knocking the boy aside. He laughed, a dry sound, and when he touched my wrist his skin was cold and slick like damp clay. The villagers said little. They had turned inward, mouths pressed tight as if to contain words that would attract the hollow's appetite. Yet at night they would gather on porches and murmur into the dark like people rehearsing prayers to get them in the right order, and sometimes, in the gaps between murmurs, I would catch a name that sounded like an apology. I tried leaving the hollow that night. I walked to the lane, the hills around pressing like a wall, and pushed my little truck to escape, but the engine would not turn over despite being in perfect condition. The battery read full, but the key turned like syrup in my hand, and the night air thickened until I felt I breathed molasses. When I walked back into the lane toward the houses, something, a small thing at first, a sound like a throat clearing, came from my own chest though I had not spoken. In the dark something, matched that sound, then added a cadence, then a name, and soon the chorus outside built with precision. My name, an old lover's pet name, the nicknames of friends I had not spoken of in a decade. I covered my ears, but the sound echoed in my bones, and the hollow opened a mouth that tasted of iron and cold water and reached out through the stones with a pressure that leaned on my knees, on the soles of my feet, and then the boy by the well sang. He had a tune in him like a bell, and as he chanted he pushed forward with something he held in his hand, a small carved bowl of clay filled with what looked like pebbles but spilled when he tipped it toward the well and flowed instead like thin, pale threads. Names, memory turned into filament, and they sank into the black and were taken with a hungry hush, Where the threads went the light left behind, and around the rim the old man's face had gone slack, and the woman who had made tea put a thumb to her lips and cried out to me in a voice ripped clean of its edges, "Do not name it back." I asked her what that meant, and she said, "If you repeat what it says to the world, it feeds twice, on the name and on the telling." Whether superstition or law, whether binding of blood or simple madness, I felt the rule like a rope around my ribs. That night, sleep was a layering of voices over silence, and when morning came my mouth felt raw as if it had been used for a bad song. The third night is the one that rearranged the world for me. Until then I had thought names and the taking were bad enough, but there are economies worse than theft. There is substitution, and the hollow does not merely take names, it swaps them, and in that swap it buries part of what you love in its dark and leaves you carrying the hollow's echo as a new, thinner self. A mother in Salim's hollow told me, while we sat in a doorway and watched the small smoke of their fires curl into a night that never warmed the air, that the first time it had happened to their line the valley had been kinder and the bargain simpler. One name given each winter for protection of the crops. But people grew greedy and then careless. They began to tell stories to keep the nights from being empty, and the hollow learned the cadence of their voices and then their faces and then their laughter until it wanted not only names but the warmth behind them. "When it takes," the mother said, voice splitting like old cloth, "you see the person who leaves, but you hear another sound. You cannot tell at once that the person is hollowed." She pointed to a man on the far porch who waved at us as if in greeting. His movements were precise, but his fingers lingered too long in the air, as though tracing a map only he could see. That week, the man's daughter fell sick with a fever, and the villagers wrapped her and put her at the center of the house where the hollow's voice reached most easily through the cracked floor, and they sang to the well because the old bargain told them it might spare the child by taking something else, some extraneous thing it could be made to accept. It took, that night, a voice, not the child's, but a neighbor's who had been known for singing at funerals, and when it was done his voice was gone from the world as if burned out, leaving him speaking in thin whistles. In exchange the child slept and recovered, but when she woke she blinked at the sun as if seeing it for the first time, and when she called her mother's name what came out was twice removed, a mimicry with the wrong rhythm that scraped like a cracked bell. The guilt of a village living with bargains is a pressure like a roof after wet snow. It will collapse if you so much as toe one strut wrong. That evening, as I walked the lane, I realized something else. The hollow's appetite had graduated to a new flavor, not simply names but memories tied to touch. I reached into my inner jacket and felt my own father's old handkerchief, the one with the faded initials, and the idea came to me that such a thing could be offered in place of a name. And in that thinking I nearly became the sacrificial mind I had come to study. They offered me tea, they offered me rooms, but most of all they offered me stories in the way people offer cloaks in winter, pulling the collars up and asking me to sit underneath. I told myself I was not part of their economy, yet the hollow's bell tolled at midnight, and with it the valley breathed and the people gathered, and when it called my name that night it did so differently. It called with a phrase from my childhood, a laugh and a line from a teacher I had loved, and the edges of those memories sharpened painfully in the dark until I leaned closer to hear and could not tell whether I leaned toward the well or into the memory. The swap happened then. I gave the hollow a sound, a recording of my brother's voice I had saved on a battered phone, played foolishly as if to confirm that sound answered across space, and in return the hollow left me with a neighbor who smiled with one side of his face the wrong way, and later that week I called my brother and his voice on the line sounded distant and tilting, as if someone else's name had been rubbed over his until he felt like a borrowed thing. People here accepted trades like that because they lessen immediate pain. Children survive, harvests hold, winter does not kill them, but the currency is the soul's ledger, and somewhere a hidden balance grows monstrous. By the time I realized the size of what I had allowed, the hollow had already learned to imitate me. A morning when I woke to the sound of my own voice from the lane, and when I looked out the window there I was, or something wearing my shape, walking toward the well in slow, mechanical steps, trailing my coat as if it had been left behind on a peg. I ran after it, and when I reached it the hollow's surface was a mirror, and it showed me my face not as I was but as what remained when someone steals the sound behind an eye, flatter, with a little hollow at the throat where laughter used to rise. The thing at the rim did not grasp or scream. It accepted me with the easy patience of a thing that has practiced long, and the villagers watched from their porches with detailed, terrible calm. I still had a name, Malik, but a part of what made Malik Malik had been eaten and replaced with the hollow's shadow sense. When the trade finished, I staggered back to the house where the woman who gave me tea held out her hands, fingers stained with water and the remnants of offerings. She looked at me with the tiredness of someone who has watched the same apple rot from the core outward and said softly, "You won't notice all of it now. Only later. The hollow is patient." And I understood then that leaving would not cure me because the swap had a tail. The hollow keeps a thread tethered to its debts, and even miles from the valley, at birthdays, in crowds, a small wrongness would surface, a pause in my speech, a name misremembered, a laugh that sounded like something else, and these would be the prices I paid for staying. That night I could not sleep, and for what felt like the first time in years I prayed bluntly, not in a posture of religion so much as in the posture of someone asking a neighbor for bread, because prayer felt like reaching beyond the hollow's ledger, and perhaps a stranger gave a stranger's mercy more weight. The sound of my prayers floated into a world that already had rules, and somewhere, I thought, someone was listening. The final part of this is not the part one prefer to retell, but it is the one required for honesty. The hollow wants a resolution that is not mercy, and it is clever enough to twist desire into the very hand it uses to reach you, and after 3 nights with trades and misgivings and a ledger I could not read without flinching, the hollow decided to collect more than habit or rudeness. It decided to demand a promise. The old man with the lantern I had met on my first night had a daughter, a woman folded into herself who never left the village and who kept watch at the well. She approached me near dawn and asked not for currency but for one thing no ledger could satisfy easily, a vow to return, spoken by my mouth and written by my hand, that I would not speak of what I had learned to anyone beyond their valley for 1 year, and that if I did break my vow I would come back to Salim's hollow and offer myself, fully as a sound. It was a bargaining position dressed as a blessing, and I thought for a heartbeat that I could refuse, that I could haul my shame and my sound out the lane and never look forward. But the air itself seemed to lean toward the woman as she spoke, and the villagers huddled close and the well breathed as if it would inhale the sky, and when she said, with a voice like dried rope, "We will not ask for more if you promise," my resistance folded like a bench under too much weight, because promises sound nobler than fear, and because I cared for the woman's child who sat mute with a pale fever under a blanket, and I thought perhaps 1 year of silence could buy a life or two. I signed on a scrap of paper with my name and a little cross because every contract needed something human to hold it fast, and as I did the hollow hummed a tone that made my teeth itch, and then the woman tied a strip of cloth about my wrist as if to bind me, and the boy who had been the hollow's small priest took one of my shoelaces and burned it in a bowl, and for a time we believed the account was settled. For 2 weeks I stayed and pretended, eating the village bread and sleeping in the corn loft and writing notes in a little book I hid under the floor because the vow required my silence but not my private record. In quiet moments I told myself I had escaped anything monstrous. Then the market day at the next town came, and with it a radio crackle, and a man who had once been my apprentice shouted a name over the air. My name. In joy because he had not seen me in years, and there I was, human as ever to him, and I answered his call on the frequency and laughed and spoke of work and of roads, and in that single breath the hollow leaned like a beast smelling blood. Later that evening as I lay in my bed the woman came in and said only, "You spoke." My blood cooled. The hollow kept its accounts with the patience of a glacier and the speed of a guillotine. At first a wind sighed, then the house's shadows lengthened, then from the well rose a sound like someone unbuttoning their mouth. The man at the lantern came to my door and did not shout so much as the village pressed itself into his shoulders, and he said, "You must come." There was no choice. I had spoken. Vows once broken do not end in words. They end in delivery. We walked to the well in a line that included children with blank eyes and neighbors who folded their hands like people at a funeral, and as we approached the rim the boy priest took my hand and pressed into my palm a shard of slate with the hollow symbol carved into it, a ring with a single vertical slash, and he said, "We are glad you kept the first part," which meant nothing and everything. The hollow asked only one thing finally. "Give your sound to us, let your name be a song the hollow can keep and sing at its will, but do not offer your breath to another." It wanted a living voice more than recorded names, and so in the shallow ditch by the well they bound my wrists and a cloth went over my mouth. and as the boy lifted his head a chorus rose from the crowd that matched the hollow's cadence, and my sound was pulled from me not with violence but with a long, patient suction, like the untying of a seam. I remember thinking in the last seconds before the hollow taught my throat to be still that perhaps promises are only a bluff to keep monsters polite. And then I felt myself sink as if the earth had become a pair of hands and drew me down, and when they let me go into the hollow's mouth I understood a new language. It is the silence that speaks. I do not know how long I was drowned inside that hollow, because the valley keeps its minutes in a pocket that does not match clock time. But when the pressure finally relented and I returned up the stone with the help of the old man's rope, some small thing in me was hollowed, a frequency missing that used to be mine. The woman wept and the child smiled, and the villagers closed their shutters and set the curtain of silence around their necks as if securing a hood. I left Salim's hollow with a name that registered still in the world, and a voice that sometimes belonged to other people on the telephone and sometimes belonged to the wind in alleys, and I promised myself to never speak the story in any telling that would feed the hollow's hunger. But perhaps this very telling is the point the hollow measured all along. How long can a sound be held? How far does a debt travel? And who ever keeps faith with bargains made in cold? I do not offer solutions, only a warning measured by my scars. If you ever come to a place older than memory and it asks your name, do not answer. Do not call back when it calls you. Promise quietly to yourself that you will not feed the silence, because the hollow keeps accounts and patience, and when it prefers your voice it will be unopened until it chooses to take it, and what it gives back in exchange will never be purely what you were.